Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library. So glad you could join me for our reading today. Reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne, chapters 25 and 26. So, um, so glad you could be with me today. Does it seem like the day's gone really fast to you? Because it seems like the day's gone really fast to me. I don't know why. It just seems that way. It just seems like I just had lunch and now all of a sudden we're doing the reading again, which is a good thing because I do love the reading and I love it probably even more than I do lunch. Um, so, just a brief recap on what's going on in our story up to this point. Our three main characters, Professor Aronnax, the manservant Conseil, and the Canadian harpooner Ned Land, were asked by the captain, Captain Nemo, to spend some time in their cabin. Basically, he was telling them, "You have," and I don't know if you remember this from the very beginning of the story, but um, when he agreed to allow them to stay on board the Nautilus, he said, "There will be times when I will need you to go to your cabin, to stay there, and don't come out until I tell you to." And in our last reading of the previous two chapters, that's exactly what happens. Something's going on, and the characters don't really know what it is. So the first mate was looking at the horizon a lot, and then the captain was taking the telescope and he was looking at the horizon a lot, and they seemed very concerned, and they were very, something's going on, and Professor Aronnax is watching this, and he's asking, what's going on, and nobody will tell him. And then the captain basically says, I'm invoking that agreement that we had at the very beginning so that you need to go into this room. He puts them in like a cell kind of, and you need to stay there until I tell you you can come out. And and Professor Aronnax asks, can I ask why? And Captain Nemo says no, and sends them off. And um, so they get there. The three of them arrive in this cell, and there's food waiting for them, and they enjoy the meal that has been set out for them. And then they realize everyone's getting really sleepy, and Professor Aronnax realizes that they drugged the food. So it's not enough, apparently, that they stay in their cabin. They uh, are being knocked out because that is the level of non interaction that they want from these guys. So when it's all over, they wake up. They wake up in their cabin this time. So somebody, clearly picked them up while they were unconscious, placed them in their cabin. Everything is all done and over with. But Captain Nemo asks our good professor, "Are you a medical doctor as well as a nautical, a marine biologist?" And and of course he says yes. He said because he is, and I guess he did some residency, which we are just learning about in this last chapter. And Captain Nemo takes him to a one of his men. One of his men has this huge wound on the side of his head, and he the professor tells Nemo he's not going to last the night. He's not going to last, more than 2 hours, really, um, and that there's really nothing that they can do to help him. And so the Captain Nemo is very upset by the whole thing. He says, "Thank you very much for looking at this at my crew member." And the next day, the ship, the Nautilus, goes to a specific location in the ocean, and they are all asked to put on. They're given the choice to come with, and the three of them decide to do so. So the captain and the three men and a crew, part of his crew, all dress in their underwater gear, and they make the trek out to this field. And there's coral everywhere. It's a big coral kind of forest, and they come across this very flat plain where they see several mounds in on the ground, and the couple of the men come out with pickaxes. They start digging a hole in the in the coral, and they realize that this is in fact a cemetery. And they have come to bury the man that Professor Aronnax looked after the day before, because he has in fact died over the night. And so um, they do this. There's a whole sort of ceremony. It's a lot of reverence. Um, the men all kneel as they place the body in the coral hole. They cover it up again, and the whole idea is that the coral will cover the land or cover the mound, and they will be sort of entombed in this coral bed. And and for Captain Nemo, he sort of waxes poetic on how this is the most probably the most wonderful thing that can happen, the best thing to be, away from the sharks. But then, of course, Nemo also says to be away from the sharks and also to be away from men, because he doesn't obviously doesn't like people, especially land people. So this show of emotion kind of changes our professor's opinion on what's going on, how this the captain, he has up until this point been very emotionless, and he's very vehement in his antisocial behavior, and to see him show such emotion, to weep over the loss of his crew member, shows that he is a human being, oddly. So that's where it ends. That chapter 24, we read on Friday, ends with that, and now we pick up again. And not only that, if you're reading along in my copy here, it says part 2. So this is actually the second part of the entire book. And as we flip over, chapter 25 is entitled The Indian Ocean. We now come to the second part of our journey under the sea. The first ended with that moving scene in the coral graveyard, which made such a deep impression on me. It made me realize that not only did Captain Nemo spend his entire life within the world's vast oceans, but he had even prepared his grave in one of the most impenetrable depths. There no sea monster would trouble the last sleep of the Nautilus's crew, of those friends bound together in death as well as in life. Nor would any men disturb them, as the captain had added. He also showed the same fierce, implacable hatred of human society. As for me, I was no longer satisfied by Conseil's theories. He still felt that the commander of the Nautilus was merely one of those unrecognized scientists, full of contempt for a world which has treated them with such indifference. He still thought of him as a misunderstood genius, who had been deceived by life on Earth and therefore taken refuge in an inaccessible region where his instincts could have free play. But to my way of thinking, this theory only explained one side of Captain Nemo. In fact, the mysterious events of the previous night, our being imprisoned and put to sleep, the violence with which the captain had snatched the telescope from my hands, and the man mortally wounded by some inexplicable collision of the Nautilus. All this made me look for other answers. No, Captain Nemo was not merely content to flee the company of men. His formidable ship was not only used to give him the freedom he wanted, but also to wreak some terrible revenge. At the moment I could see nothing clearly, just vague glimmers of light in the darkness. But right now I must limit myself to describing my thoughts as they were slowly formed by succeeding events. Nothing bound us to Captain Nemo. He knew it was impossible to escape from the Nautilus. We had not promised to remain on board. We were merely captives, prisoners whom he called guests just for the sake of politeness. All the same, Ned Land had not given up hope of regaining his freedom. He was certain to take advantage of the first opportunity presented him, and I would undoubtedly do the same. And yet, I could not have gone without a certain feeling of regret, for the captain had been so generous in letting me share the Nautilus's secrets. And in addition, was this man to be hated or admired? Was he a martyr or an executioner? Also, to be perfectly frank, before leaving him forever, I wanted to finish this underwater journey around the world, which had already begun so splendidly. I wanted to see all the marvels contained in the Earth's oceans. I wanted to see what no man had seen before, even though I might have to pay with my life for my insatiable curiosity. What I had seen, what had I seen until then? Nothing, or almost nothing, for we had so far only traveled 6,000 leagues across the Pacific. But I knew only too well that the Nautilus was sailing toward uninhabited lands, and that if some chance of escaping arose, it would be cruel to spoil things for my companions merely because of my passionate curiosity for the unknown. I would have to follow them, perhaps even lead them, but would we ever get this opportunity? The ordinary man in me, deprived of his free will, longed for such an occasion, but the scientist in me dreaded it. At noon of that day, January 21st, 1868, the first mate came out on deck to take our position. I went up to the platform, lit a cigar, and watched him carry out his task. He seemed clear that he did not understand French, for I made several remarks which, if he had understood me, would have evoked some reaction. But he remained impassive and silent. While he was looking through his sextant, one of the sailors of the Nautilus, that powerful man who had accompanied us on our first underwater excursion to Crespo Island, came to clean the windows around the compartment containing the light. I took this opportunity to examine it. It contained lenses which, as in lighthouses, increased its strength 100-fold and sent its light out in the desired direction. This electrical device had been constructed so as to give every possible bit of light. It worked in a vacuum, which gave it both regularity and strength. This vacuum also saved the graphite points between which ran the electric arc, and this was an important economy for Captain Nemo, for he could not easily have replaced them. In this manner they scarcely suffered any wear at all. When the Nautilus was about to dive again, I went back down to the lounge. The hatches were closed, and our course set due west. We were then traveling through the Indian Ocean, that vast liquid plain which covers an area of 2,125,000 square miles, and whose waters are so clear that anyone looking down through their surface gets a feeling of vertigo. The Nautilus generally cruised at a depth between 300 and 600 feet. We went on like this for several days. For anyone but me, with my great love of the sea, the hours would have seemed long and monotonous. But my daily walks on the platform, where I soaked up the bracing sea air, the spectacle of these rich waters through the glass panels of the lounge, the reading of the books in the library, and the drawing up of my notes used all my time and left me not a single moment of boredom or weariness. All of us remained in perfect health. The food on board seemed to agree with us marvelously, and, as for me, I could easily have done without the variations Ned Land managed to bring on board in a spirit of protest. Moreover, living at such a constant temperature, we did not even have to worry about catching colds. Besides, the Madreporaria dendrophilia, known in the south of France as sea fennel, and of which there was a certain stock on board, would have made an excellent medicine against coughs. For several days we saw a great quantity of gulls. Some were very skillfully shot and cooked in a special way, furnished a very agreeable dish of sea game. Among the birds which stay far away from any land and rest on the surface of the ocean when they are tired from flying, I saw some magnificent albatross, which belong to the family of the longipennes, and with their harsh cry, which sounds like a donkey braying, the family of Totipalmatre, uh, was represented by fast-flying petrels, which are so quick at catching fish swimming near the surface, and by numerous phaethons, or tropic birds, uh, and especially the red-striped phaethon, which is about the size of a pigeon and whose white body feathers shaded with pink contrast sharply with its black wings. The Nautilus's nets brought in several kinds of sea turtles, mainly hawkbills, with their rounded backs and highly prized shells. These reptiles can dive easily and stay underwater a long time merely by closing the valves situated at the end of their nasal passages. Several of these hawkbills were still asleep inside their shells when we captured them. This is the way they can rest and remain protected from attack by other ocean animals. The flesh of these turtles is not too good, but their eggs make an exquisite dish. As for fish, they called forth our greatest admiration when the mystery of their underwater life was unveiled through the open panels of the lounge. I noted several species which I had not yet been able to observe. I will mention mainly the trunk fishes, peculiar to the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, and the waters of equatorial South America. These fish, like turtles, armadillos, sea urchins, and shellfish, have a covering which is neither chalky nor stony, but made of true bone. Sometimes it is shaped like a triangle, and sometimes like a square. Among the triangular variety, I noted some about 2 inches long with a brown tail and yellow fins, whose flesh is not only exquisite but very healthy. I recommend that these fish be acclimatized to fresh water, a change which many saltwater fish can undergo with little difficulty. I also saw square trunkfish with 4 large bumps on their backs, trunkfish with white dots on their bellies, which can be tamed like birds, trigoniae armed with spines formed by an extension of their bony shell, and whose strange grunting sound has earned them the name of sea pigs. And then dromedary fish with their large conical humps, whose flesh is tough and leathery. In Conseil's daily notes, I also noticed certain fish of the genus Tetraodon, peculiar to these waters. Spenglerians with a red back and white chest, which can be recognized by their 3 longitudinal rows of filaments, and electric tetrodons, 7 inches long and very brightly colored. Then, among other genera, were ovoids, which looked like a brownish black egg and had white stripes and no tail, the porcupine fish covered with spines and capable of blowing themselves up until they formed a spiked ball, seahorses common to all oceans, flying pegasi with their long snout, whose very large wing-shaped pectoral fins permit them to fly, or permit them, if not to fly, at least to jump into the air. Macrognathi with long jaws, splendid fish 10 inches long and brilliantly colored, pale dragonets with their round heads, myriads of jumping blennies with black stripes and long pectoral fins, dashing along the surface at tremendous speed, delicious velifera who can raise their fins and use them like sails to catch favorable currents, magnificent Cerdidae, on whom nature has lavished yellow, sky blue, silver, and gold, Trichoptera with their wings made of filaments, miller's thumbs with their lemon-colored spots making slight hissing noises, gurnards, whose liver is considered poisonous, greenlings with mobile flaps over their eyes, and finally bellows fish with their long tube-like snouts, true flycatchers of the sea, armed as they are with a gun unequaled to chassopots or Remingtons, which kills insects merely by striking them with a drop of water. In the 89th genus of fish, according to Lacippides classification, and belonging to the second subclass of bony fish characterized by a gill cover and a bronchial membrane, I noticed a scorpion fish whose head is armed with spines and which has only one dorsal fin. These are with or without scales depending on their subgenus. The second subgenus gave us specimens of Didactyla, 12 to 16 inches long, with yellow stripes and a fantastically shaped head. As for the first subgenus, it was furnished us with several specimens of that strange fish called the anglerfish, which has a large head covered with ridges and bumps. It has spines all over its body, along with two irregular and hideous horns. Its body and tail are covered with calluses, and its sting can inflict a serious wound. It is a repulsive and horrible fish. From the 21st to the 23rd of January, the Nautilus traveled 250 leagues, or 540 miles. Or, in other words, it averaged 22 knots. During this time, we saw many kinds of fish which were attracted by the electric light and which tried to follow alongside. Most of them, though, were soon outdistanced by the Nautilus, but some managed to remain next to us for quite some time. On the morning of the 24th, we sighted the Keeling Islands at 12 degrees 5 minutes south latitude and 94 degrees 33 minutes east longitude. These coral formations, with their magnificent coconut trees, had been visited by both Darwin and Captain Fitzroy. The Nautilus sailed in close to the reefs surrounding these deserted islands. Its dredges brought up many specimens of polyps and echinoderms, along with strange shells from the subkingdom of mollusks. Several precious shells of the species Delphinula were added to Captain Nemo's collection, and I also added a spotted astrea, a kind of parasitical polypary often attached to a shell. But soon the Keeling Islands disappeared beneath the horizon, and our course was set to the northwest, toward the tip of the Indian Peninsula. Civilization, Ned Land said to me one day. It's certainly better than that New Guinea where there are more savages than deer. In India, Professor, there are roads and railroads and towns with Englishmen and Frenchmen and Hindus. Why, you wouldn't have to walk more than 5 miles to meet a fellow countryman. What do you say? Isn't it about time to part company with Captain Nemo? No, Ned, I said in a firm tone of voice. Let's let things ride. The Nautilus is going toward the inhabited parts of the globe. It's heading for Europe. Why don't we let it take us there? Once we're in our own waters, then we'll see what we can do. Besides, I don't imagine that Captain Nemo will allow us to go hunting on the coasts of Malabar or Coromandel the way he did in New Guinea. Well then, monsieur, why can't we do without his permission? I did not answer the Canadian. I wanted no arguments. Also, at heart, I wanted to make full use of the stroke of fate which had thrown me aboard the Nautilus. After leaving the Keeling Islands, we traveled at a slower speed and often very capriciously, often diving very deep for no apparent reason. Using the ship's side fins, we occasionally reached depths of 1 or 2 miles, but without ever attaining the bottom of the Indian Ocean, which soundings of 42,500 feet have not been able to reach. As for the temperature of these lower depths, The thermometer read a constant 39 degrees. I did, however, notice that the upper layers of the sea were always colder in shallow water than in open ocean. On January 25th, the sea was completely deserted and the Nautilus spent the day on the surface, with its powerful propellers striking the water and making it shoot up to great heights. This was undoubtedly one of the factors that made people think it was a giant whale. I spent most of the day on the platform, looking at the ocean. Nothing happened on the horizon until about 4 o'clock, when I saw a long streamer off to the west heading in the opposite direction. Its masts were visible for a moment, but it couldn't have seen the Nautilus, which lay so flat in the water. I thought to myself that this steamship probably belonged to the Peninsular and Orient Company, which runs between Ceylon and Sydney, touching at King George Sound and Melbourne. At 5 in the afternoon, just before the rapid twilight which binds day to night in the tropics, Conseil and I witnessed a strange and marvelous sight. There is a charming animal which the ancients said it was good luck to meet. Aristotle, Athenaeus, Pliny, Oppian studied its habits and described it with all the poetry of Greece and Rome. They called it the Nautilus, or the Pompilius, whereas nowadays it is called the Argonaut. Anyone consulting Conseil would have learned from this worthy fellow that the subkingdom of mollusks is divided into 5 classes, and that the first of these classes, that of the cephalopods, which are sometimes naked and sometimes covered with a shell, comprises 2 families, Dibranchiata and the Tetrabranchiata, distinguished by the number of gill plumes they have. That the family of Dibranchiata includes 3 genera, the Argonaut, the squid, and the sepia, and that the family of the Tetrabranchiata only contains 1, the Nautilus. After this explanation, it would be inexcusable for anyone to confuse the Argonaut, which is acetobulliferous, that is to say, equipped with siphons, and the Nautilus, which is tentaculi ferris, or in other words, equipped with tentacles. It was a school of these Argonauts which was just then traveling along the surface. We could make out several hundred, and they belonged to a species which only exists in the Indian Ocean. These graceful mollusks move backward by breathing water in and then squirting it out through a tube. Of their 8 tentacles, 6, long and thin, were floating in the water, while the other 2, rounded and palm-shaped, were held up in the wind like small sails. I could clearly make out their wavy, spiraled shells, which Cuvier so justly compared to elegant longboats. And the shell really is like a boat, for the animal inside does not adhere to this shell he has made. The Argonaut is free to leave his shell, I said to Conseil, but he never does. Just like Captain Nemo, Conseil wisely answered. Perhaps he would have done better to call his ship the Argonaut. For about an hour the Nautilus cruised amid the school of mollusks. Then, suddenly, they were seized by some kind of fear. As if at a signal, all the sails were taken down, all the tentacles pulled in, the bodies contracted, and the shells turned over to alter their center of gravity. Then the entire flotilla disappeared beneath the surface. It was instantaneous, and no naval squadron could have maneuvered with greater precision. Just then, night came on, and the little waves brought on by a breeze died down peacefully around the Nautilus. On the next day, January 26th, we crossed the equator at the 82nd meridian and re-entered the northern hemisphere. During the entire day, a formidable school of sharks followed the ship. That part of the world abounds in these terrible animals, which make the seas so dangerous. There were Port Jackson sharks with a brown back and whitish belly, armed with 11 rows of teeth, eyed sharks whose neck had a large black spot encircled in white and resembling an eye, Isabel sharks with a rounded snout covered with dark dots. Often these powerful animals would rush at the glass panels of the lounge with such violence as to make me very nervous. Ned Land was beside himself. He wanted the submarine to surface and give him a chance to harpoon these monsters. He was particularly excited by several dogfish whose mouths were lined with teeth arranged like a mosaic, and some large tiger sharks 15 feet long. But soon the Nautilus increased its speed and quickly outdistanced the fastest of these sharks. On January 27th, off the entrance of the vast Bay of Bengal, we several times came across a very grim sight. Cadavers floating on the surface. They were the dead from Indian villages who had been carried out to sea by the Ganges, and whom the vultures, the country's only morticians, had not finished devouring. But there was no lack of sharks to help them in their grisly task. Toward 7 in the evening, the Nautilus cruised half submerged through a whitish sea. As far as one could see, the ocean seemed to be made of milk. Was it some effect of the moon's rays? No, for the new moon was still hidden from sight beneath the horizon. Although the sky was lit up by light from the stars, it seemed black by contrast with the whiteness of the water. Conseil couldn't believe his eyes, and he asked me what caused this strange phenomenon. Fortunately, I was able to give him an answer. That's what is called a milk sea, I said. It takes place off the coasts of Amboina and in these waters. But could monsieur tell me, asked Conseil, what produces such an effect? For I can't imagine that the water's actually been changed into milk. No, my boy, this whiteness is due to the presence of myriads of tiny creatures like little luminous worms with jelly-like, colorless bodies about the thickness of a hair and less than 1/100th of an inch in length. These creatures sometimes attach themselves to one another over a distance of several miles. Several miles, cried Conseil. Yes, my boy, and don't try to figure out how many that would take. You won't be able to, for if I'm not mistaken, some sailors have traveled over these milk seas for 40 miles. I don't know if Conseil paid any attention to my advice, but he became lost in thought, undoubtedly trying to calculate how many creatures 1/100th of an inch in length could be contained in a space 40 miles square. As for me, I continued observing the phenomenon. For several hours the Nautilus sailed through this white expanse, and I noticed that it slipped through this soapy water without a sound, as if it were in the midst of one of those frothy eddies sometimes seen between the currents entering and leaving bays. Toward midnight the sea once again took on its ordinary color. But behind us, right out to the limits of the horizon, the sky reflected the whiteness of the water and for a long time seemed illuminated by the vague glimmers of an aurora borealis. Chapter 26. A New Invitation from Captain Nemo. At noon on February 28th, when the Nautilus surfaced at 9 degrees 4 minutes north latitude, we sighted land lying 8 miles off the west. First, I noticed a group of mountains rising in very peculiar shapes to a height of about 2,000 feet. Once our position had been determined, I went back down to the lounge and looked at the chart. We were off Ceylon, that pearl which hangs below the Indian peninsula. I went to the library looking for some book on this island, one of the most fertile on earth, and I found one by Sir H.C. Esquire, called Ceylon and the Cingalese. I went back to the lounge and first of all learned that Ceylon was situated between 5 degrees 55 minutes and 9 degrees 49 minutes north latitude and 79 degrees 42 minutes and 82 degrees 4 minutes east longitude. It is 275 miles long and 150 miles wide at its largest point. It is 900 miles in circumference and 24,448 square miles in area. Or, in other words, it is a little smaller than Ireland. Just then, Captain Nemo and the first mate appeared. After taking a look at the charts, Captain Nemo turned toward me and said, "Ceylon is famous for its pearl fisheries. Would you enjoy visiting one of them, Monsieur Aronnax?" I certainly would, Captain." "Fine. It will be easy, but even though we will see the fisheries, we will not see any fishermen. Their season has not begun yet. Never mind. I'll give the order to head for the Gulf of Mannar, where we'll arrive during the night." The captain said several words to the first mate, who immediately left the room. Soon the Nautilus dove, and after a while we could see by the pressure gauge that it was maintaining a depth of 100 feet. I looked for the Gulf of Mannar on the chart. I found it along the 9th parallel off the northwest coast of Ceylon. One side of it was formed by a prolongation of Little Mannar Island. In order to get there, we had to travel up the whole western coast of Ceylon. "Professor," said Captain Nemo, "there are pearl fisheries in the Bay of Bengal, in the Indian Ocean, in the China Sea, and the Japan Sea, off America in the Gulf of Panama and the Gulf of California. But the finest pearl fishing is off the coast of Ceylon. However, we'll be arriving a bit early. The fishermen only come to the Gulf of Mannar during the month of March, and then for 30 days their 300 boats ferret out this treasure of the sea. Each boat has 10 men to row and 10 to fish. The latter are divided into 2 groups who take turns diving. They go down as deep as 40 feet using a heavy stone they grip with their feet and which is attached to the boat by means of a rope." "You mean to say," I exclaimed, "that they still use such primitive methods?" "Yes," answered Captain Nemo. "Even though these fisheries belong to the world's most industrious people, the English, who got them by the Treaty of Amiens in 1802. But I should think that a diving suit like the ones you have, would be very useful for such work." "Yes, these poor fishermen can't stay underwater for long. The Englishman, Percival, in describing his voyage to Ceylon, mentions a Kaffir who could stay down for 5 minutes before coming back up to the surface. But I find this hard to believe. I know that some divers can stay down for 57 seconds, and the most skillful for 87 seconds. But they are very rare, and when these poor creatures get back to the boat, blood-stained water pours out of their nose and ears. I think that they can stay down for an average of 30 seconds, and during this time they toss as many pearl oysters as they can grab into a little sack. But generally they don't live long. Their eyes grow weak or become ulcerated, their bodies become covered with sores, and sometimes they die of a stroke underwater." "Yes," I said, "it's a sad way to earn a living, and especially when you think it's all done just to satisfy a few people's whims. But tell me, Captain, how many oysters can a boat take in during a day?" "From 40 to 50,000. I've even heard it said that in 1814, when the British government sent out some of its own divers, they brought in 76 million oysters in 20 days. Do these fishermen at least make a fairly good living?" "Hardly, Professor. At Panama, they earn $1 a week. Usually they earn a penny for each oyster containing a pearl, and then when you think of how many oysters they bring up containing nothing, they only make a penny, but their employers get rich. That's awful. You and your companions will now be able to visit the manar beds, Professor, said Captain Nemo. And if by chance some fisherman is operating out of season, we'll be able to watch him work. Fine, Captain. By the way, Monsieur Aronnax, are you afraid of sharks? Sharks, I exclaimed. It struck me as a rather ridiculous question. Well, said Captain Nemo, I must admit, Captain, that I've had little experience with this species of fish. We on the Nautilus are quite accustomed to them, said Captain Nemo, and after a while you'll get used to them too. Moreover, we'll be armed, and on the way we'll perhaps be able to do a little shark hunting. It's very interesting. We'll see you early tomorrow morning then, Professor. After saying this in an offhand manner, Captain Nemo left the room. If someone invited you to go bear hunting in the Swiss mountains, you would say, "Fine, tomorrow we'll go bear hunting." But if someone invited you to go lion hunting in the Atlas Plains or tiger hunting in the jungles of India, you would say, "Aha, it looks like we're going tiger or lion hunting." But if someone asked you to go hunting sharks in their own element, you would perhaps want to think it over for a minute or two before accepting. As for me, I passed my hand over my forehead and found I had broken out in a cold sweat. Let's take our time, I said to myself, and give this matter a little thought. It was one thing hunting sea otters in underwater forests, as we did off Crespo Island, but it's something else again walking over the ocean floor when you're almost sure to meet sharks. I know perfectly well that in certain countries, particularly the Andaman Islands, the people don't hesitate to attack sharks with a dagger in one hand and a noose in the other. But I also know that many of them don't come back alive. Besides, I'm not one of them, and even if I were, I might be a bit nervous about doing something like this. So there I was, daydreaming about sharks capable of cutting a man in two with their row upon row of teeth. I could already feel a pain in my side. In addition, I was disturbed by the offhand way the captain had invited me. He had said it as if we were going to hunt harmless foxes in some forest. Well, I thought, Conseil wouldn't think of going, and that way I'll be able to get out of accompanying the captain. As for Ned Land, I wasn't sure how he would take the news, however great a danger might be. It always appealed to his combative nature. I again took up the book on Ceylon, but I could not concentrate on it. Between the lines, I kept seeing terrifying, wide-open jaws. Just then, Conseil and the Canadian entered, looking calm and happy. They didn't know what I didn't know what was waiting for them. "Goodness me, monsieur," said Ned Land. "That darn Captain Nemo of yours just made us a very pleasant proposition." "Oh," I said, "so you know." "With monsieur's permission," answered Conseil. "The commander of the Nautilus has invited us to visit, along with monsieur, the magnificent Ceylonese pearl fisheries. He has asked us very politely and acted like a true gentleman." "Did he tell you anything else?" "No, monsieur," answered the Canadian, "except that he had already spoken to you about this little excursion." "That's right," I said, "but he didn't go into the matter of—" "No, Professor, you'll be coming with us, won't you?" "Me? Oh, yes. I see you like the idea, Ned." "Yes, it might be very interesting." "And maybe dangerous," I said, in an insinuating tone of voice. "Dangerous?" replied Ned Land. A mere excursion in an oyster bed? Obviously, Captain Nemo had not felt it was necessary to tell my companions about the sharks. As for me, I couldn't help feeling worried as I looked at them as if they were already missing some limb. Should I warn them? Undoubtedly, I should have, but I didn't know how to go about it. Would Monsieur, said Conseil, give us some information on pearl fishing? On the fishing itself, I asked, or on the incidents which. On the fishing itself. I'm sorry. On the fishing itself, replied the Canadian. It's always best not to be completely ignorant of something you're about to do. Well, then, sit down, my friends, and I'll tell you everything I've just learned from a book on Ceylon and the Sinhalese. Ned and Conseil sat down on a couch, and the first thing the Canadian asked was, Monsieur, just what is a pearl? Ned, I answered, to the poet, a pearl is an ocean tear. To Orientals, it is a drop of hardened dew. To women, it is an oblong jewelry with glassy sheen, which they wear on their finger, around their neck, or on their ear. To a chemist, it is a mixture of calcium phosphate and calcium carbonate, with a bit of gelatin, and finally, to the naturalist, it is merely an abnormal secretion from the same organ which produces mother of pearl in certain bivalves. Subkingdom of mollusks, class of Acephalia, order of Testacea. That's right, Conseil. Now, among these testacea, the abalones, turbos, and tridacnae, and pinnae or, in other words, all those which secrete mother of pearl, that blue, violet, or white substance which coats the inside of their valves, are capable of producing pearls. Can mollusks or mussels produce them too? Asked the Canadian. Yes, mussels of certain rivers in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Saxony, Bohemia, and France sometimes produce pearls. I see, replied the Canadian. But, I continued, the mollusk that produces the vast majority of the world's pearls is the pearl oyster. Meligarina margaritifera. Try saying that. And a pearl is nothing but mother of pearl that has formed into the shape of a ball. It either sticks to the oyster's shell or becomes loosely embedded in its flesh. It always starts from some tiny, hard object, excuse me, a sterile egg, or a grain of sand, or over which a coating of mother of pearl is built up in thin, concentric layers over a period of several years. Excuse me. Is more than one pearl ever found in an oyster? Asked Conseil. Yes, my boy, some oysters are veritable jewel boxes. I've even read of an oyster, but can hardly believe it, which contained no less than 150 sharks. 150 sharks? Cried Ned Land. Did I say sharks? I cried. I meant to say 150 pearls. It wouldn't make any sense to say sharks. It certainly wouldn't, said Conseil. But would Monsieur tell us how these pearls are removed from the oysters? There are several ways of doing it, and often, if they are stuck to the valves, the fishermen have to take them out with pliers. But usually the oysters are spread out on mats of esparto grass covering the banks. They soon die in the open air, and after 10 days, when they have rotted sufficiently, they are dumped into huge tanks of seawater. After this, they are opened and washed. Then begins the double task of the extractors. First, they remove the layers of mother of pearl known in the business as true silver bastard white and bastard black, which are sent off in cases weighing between 250 and 300 pounds. Then they remove the flesh of the oyster, boil it, and finally put it through a strainer so as not to lose even the tiniest pearls. Doesn't the price of pearls vary according to their size? Asked Conseil. It not only varies according to their size, I replied, but also according to their shape, their water or color, and their orient, or that luster which makes them so attractive to the eye. The loveliest pearls are called virgin pearls or paragons. They grow isolated in the mollusk's flesh. They are white, often opaque, but sometimes of an opal-like transparency, and usually spherical or pear-shaped. The spherical ones are used to make bracelets, whereas the pear-shaped ones are reserved for pendants, and since they are the most valuable, these last are sold individually. The other pearls, which stick to the shell, are less regular in shape and are therefore sold by weight. Finally, even further down the scale, there are the little pearls known as seed pearls, and they are sold in bulk and are mainly used for the embroideries on church vestments. But it must be a very long, hard job separating pearls according to their size, said the Canadian. No, my friend, this work is done with 11 sieves, or strainers, pierced with a very number of holes. Pearls too large to pass through the sieves, with 20 to 80 holes, are considered as being of the first category. Those which cannot get through the strainers with 100 to 800 holes are second category pearls. And finally, those for which they have no use, sieves with 900 to 1,000 holes, are the seed pearls. That is very clever, said Conseil. They do the whole thing mechanically. And now, could monsieur tell us how much money is made from pearl fishing? According to the book I've just read, I answered, the Ceylon fisheries are rented out each year for the sum of 600,000 sharks. You mean dollars, said Conseil. Yes, dollars. $600,000, I continued. But I don't think the fisheries bring in as much nowadays as they used to. And it's the same with American fisheries. During the reign of Charles V, they brought in $800,000 a year. And now it's only about two-thirds of that. In short, I think the annual income from pearl fishing is about $1,800,000. And haven't there been some famous pearls of great value? Asked Conseil. Yes, my boy. They say that Caesar offered Servilia a pearl estimated at $4,000 in terms of today's currency. I've even heard people claim, said the Canadian, that there was a certain lady in the olden days who drank pearls in her vinegar. That was Cleopatra, answered Conseil. Must have tasted awful. Terrible, said Conseil. But it's not everybody who can claim to have drunk a little glass of vinegar worth $3,000. Too bad I didn't marry that lady, said the Canadian, making a rather disquieting gesture. Ned Land married to Cleopatra, cried Conseil. I was all set to get married, said the Canadian, answered seriously. And it isn't my fault if it all fell through. I even bought my fiancée, Kate Tinder, a pearl necklace. And then she went off and married someone else. And that necklace cost me no more than $1.50, even though, and you'll just have to take my word for it, Professor, the pearls in it were about the largest I've ever seen. Ned, my boy, I answered laughingly, those were artificial pearls, little glass balls coated inside with a substance called essence d'Orient. Really? Replied Ned. But that stuff they used to coat them with must cost a lot of money. No, Ned, it's nothing more than a silvery substance gotten from the scales of a fish called the bleak and preserved in ammonia. It's almost worthless. Maybe that's why Kate Tender married someone else, Ned Land said philosophically. But to come back to real pearls, I said, I don't think any king has ever owned a finer one than Captain Nemo. This one here, said Conseil, pointing to the magnificent pearl in its glass case. Yes, it must be worth 400,000 dollars, said Conseil emphatically. Yes, I said $400,000. It is undoubtedly it, and it undoubtedly didn't cost the captain more than the effort of picking it up. Well, said Ned Land, who's to say that tomorrow on our excursion we won't come across another one like it? Nonsense, exclaimed Conseil. Why not? What good would all the money do us on board the Nautilus? On board, maybe not, said Ned Land, but somewhere else? Where else? Said Conseil, shaking his head. Yes, I said, Ned's right. If we ever brought a pearl like that back to Europe or America, it would help a lot toward making people believe the story of our adventures. I should say so, said the Canadian. But, said Conseil, always coming back to the practical side of things, is pearl fishing dangerous? No, I answered quickly, and especially if you take certain precautions. What do you risk in this business? Said Ned Land. Swallowing several mouthfuls of water? That's about it, Ned. By the way, I said, trying to adopt Captain Nemo's offhand tone of voice, are you afraid of sharks? Me? Answered the Canadian. A professional harpooner? It's part of my job to laugh at them. It's not a question of fishing for them with a swivel hook, I said, hauling them on deck, cutting off their tail with an axe, opening up their bellies, tearing out their heart, and throwing it into the sea. Then you mean we're going to... That's right. Underwater? Underwater. As for me, just give me a good harpoon. Besides, monsieur, you probably already know that sharks are built in a kind of odd way. They have to turn over in order to grab you, and that gives you time to... Ned Land had a way of saying the word grab that made a chill run down my spine. Well, Conseil, what about you? What do you think of sharks? In all frankness, said Conseil. Thank heavens, I thought. If monsieur is willing to face sharks, said Conseil, I don't see why his faithful servant shouldn't be willing to face them too. And with that little jaunty bit of comedy, we end chapter 26 and our reading for today. Thank you so much for joining me for the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. Be with us again in 2 days on Wednesday at 4 p.m., and we will read the next 2 chapters of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Thank you so much for being here, and we will see you again. Goodbye, everyone.